Fundamentally, there's some big issues introduced by some new technologies. New technologies can make our lives easier. Like this morning, I told the green fan to turn on from bed without having to get up and get it on. On the other hand, some of these technologies can be intrusive and have unanticipated consequences. Well, that's true of new technologies of their time, like washing machines and bottled milk. And that's the reason that we have Consumer Reports. Consumer Reports is really good and has been really good for over 80 years, taking a look at the unintended consequences of new technology. That's why I'm helping out Consumer Reports maybe for the next 80 years and beyond, because we need people to take a good look at this stuff and to help us figure out what's going on. Beyond that, regulation in the US has really helped us out in a lot of ways. On the other hand, the environment in Washington right now is pretty toxic, and there's a lot of good work going on in potential regulation in California, which might lead the way. We don't want things like a patchwork of 50 different laws regarding privacy, say, but California may prove a model there, and those of us who primarily live there, it's incumbent on us to do what we can, usually in quiet back channels, nudging people into pretty good directions. And that's something I'm committed to do relentlessly, but fairly quietly, even though that goes against my grain, because I prefer to be transparent, but also I have to remember to do no harm. So the idea is that we are seeing some good law potentially coming. An unexpected development, but one of which I feel pretty good about, is that, well, my fellow computer nerds have a natural tendency in our naivete to want to do the right thing, whatever the right thing might be. Part of quiet back channel work means encouraging software people to follow their instincts, to try to treat people like we want to be treated. That's beginning to help as programmers in large companies begin to stand up saying that people should do the right thing no matter what the lawyers are saying. And usually the lawyers are right when it comes to things like corporate law and stuff like that. But it may be time to free the nerds, because that may have unanticipated good consequences, which I think will lead to a good balance between internal regulation and the regulation which we think will come from a government. And again, I think a lot of it will come from Sacramento. The downside of that being is that I may actually have to go to Sacramento, which is even worse than having to go to Yonkers. That, of course, is a Consumer Reports joke, but it relates to a regrettable incident involving me and wild turkeys, which I don't want to relive.
You can see me afterwards for that story.
Thank you, Craig. So I actually have a question for our panel as I reflect on what I heard, which is the response at best, we have to accept that all of this, what tech does for us now it's a private marketplace, and it's just about whether it's organizing consumers to, demand change their own purchasing behavior to affect change, or it's about mobilizing the powers of government to put some guardrails into place. One thing that strikes me as interesting is that so much of our civic life, which used to be something we would do in public spaces that are owned by the public, are now done on private platforms, right? So we have the phenomenon of the Facebook town meeting, for example, which is nothing like a real town meeting. And, we still have this, decades-old agency called the U.S. Postal Service that tries to deliver, along with other private companies, the mail. And in many places, it's still a fundamental piece of civic bedrock. The same thing with libraries, public schools, and so on. So is there anywhere in this moment of crisis and opportunity that you can envision a role for the public sector actually providing some of these public goods? Or are we the best we can do is we're stuck with, let's regulate them the way we regulate, say, the electric companies? Harold, Sabeel, I think I'm directing that first to the two of you.
All right. I do have to just point out, freeing the nerds was what got us here. And, you know, I like to think that I didn't waste my time and the last 25 years of my life acquiring a set of skills and expertise that might have some value in the same way that coding has value. And the fact is that we all have things to contribute and we all need to work together. And the notion that human beings are not human beings because they are engineers rather than lawyers, or that lawyers are not human beings because they're lawyers and not engineers, is what got us here right now. But one of the issues is, getting back to, you know, some engineering and some economics, is you do have to deal with this economies of scale issue and these new entrance ideas. And it all goes back to also, what are you trying to do? If the notion is, can I create a space where people could go if they wanted to have the kind of civic discussions that we think are important, then yeah, you can do that. Do I think that that will change the dynamic around dominant companies? I don't think so. There are too many factors that play into why these companies now have dominance, and this whole idea of tipping points, which is ultimately where the problem is why there has to be some set of circuit breakers, including, you know, and some of that is the public accountability stuff, and empowering people to find out about what's going on and enabling that vote with your feet thing. But, you know, at the end of the day, that's just not going to be enough.
Yeah, just to add to that, I mean, it's a really tough question that you're posing, Mika, because on the one hand, you know, you want to say, as Harold's saying, right, there's the business models are such that, you know, there's going to be a continued agglomeration to act as infrastructure, and so, you know, the public utility analogy, I think, is compelling to me in the sense that that's a way to kind of, you can see a path from where we are now to a set of regulations that makes the infrastructure serve the public good. And then the analogy to sort of the creation of the FCC, for example, as you were saying, Harold. But I also hear another question, another piece of your question, right, which is that how can you be a democracy if in a world where the public sphere no longer exists, where most of our public spaces, what we think of as public spaces, even physically in New York, are actually privately owned and operated, right, because of how some of the development deals are struck. And then the digital version of this, the Facebook town hall versus an actual town hall, is a classic notion of someone getting up on a soapbox. Like, that's actually a really hard question, because you need at some point that infrastructure, that civic infrastructure, has to be in our hands, we the people. Otherwise, we can't really expect it to be there the way it needs to be there. What that then means about how we approach sort of a fully digitized public sphere, I mean, my own view about this is, I think we need sort of a many tactics kind of approach. There's no one silver bullet. This is why we need to sort of reinvest in the kind of civil society capacity that Marta's talking about, and kind of oversight and regulation that Harold's talking about, and then also just actual public goods that we need to be providing. Libraries, schools, spaces like this one where people can gather and share ideas. I also will point out that a lot of this happens in behind the scenes as well. So very quickly, you know, there are all these hidden ways in which this stuff plays out. So we just put out a report a couple months ago about credit ratings agencies, for example. It's one of those key areas where information is aggregated that acts as a gatekeeper to whether people can get loans and can access to finance. And one of the thoughts is, should that function actually be publicly provided instead of privately provided, where there's so much incentive for exploitation and extraction? So the public goods question, I think, can show up in a lot of
considering that we
spaces.
currently give lots of subsidies to these companies, especially the telcos, to expand their own market for them, and which they don't necessarily even do everything they said they would do. I think we have just a few minutes, so I'm going to try and get to one or two questions. Danielle, if you can run around, raise your hand if you've got one. Danielle, you pick people.
All right. Let us try you in the front row. You get a point for sitting in the front.
Yes.
Just like in college. Hello, everyone. My name is Sahar. I'm on Team Human. And I think about this a lot. And one thing that seems to me that doesn't get talked about too much is how our different proposed solutions are really much in tension with each other. And a solution to one problem will make another problem worse. So for example, if you restrain Facebook and Google, their competitors are the shady ad tech firms that are just like worse at surveillance. If you break up Instagram off Facebook, the Instagram safety team will not have the same resources it has now to fight misinformation. If you encrypt everything, then dealing with propaganda gets a lot harder. Are these truly in tension? Is there really an alternative to nationalization? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, actually, I think about that a lot too. It's one of the things that makes this complicated, although, again, public policy is about trade-offs. And that's one of the reasons why it's the quintessential role of government, because as messy and as, at the moment, toxic that it is, that is the mechanism by which we come to some sort of livable societal consensus that doesn't involve people shooting each other. I think that they're not as much in tension as some folks may think. One of the reasons why I believe in things like regulatory agencies is because, you try to balance those things. And there are solutions that may promote competition but not get into the economies of scale that I didn't have a chance to get into, but things that open up the platform in a variety of ways. And so it's all still there, but it's shared. Sometimes it's the government builds the big infrastructure, and then everybody runs over that because you've overcome some of the huge costs that were involved in setting up in the first place. But ultimately, there are going to be a bunch of trade-offs, and that's where our values come in, is determining, do we value privacy more than certain steps we might take to promote competition? Or do we value privacy more than our concern that people are organizing hate crimes and terrorist attacks? These are not easy questions. Their answers are not obvious, and that's why this is hard and takes a while and requires public debate.
I actually wanted to, yes, everything he said, and my mic is working. I think what it all comes back to is this three-legged stool of civil society, government, and the private sector. And what we know to be true is that the public sector has been hollowed out. And that's decades in the making, right? Underinvestment. They're the problem, and for whatever phase of innovation we may be in, that happens to be the solution. And yes, we have also a public that has been lulled into these great conveniences. We all have, shouldn't be ashamed if you're an Amazon Prime member. There's a very good reason why you are. And the business world and the market, the invisible hand is not benevolent, and so this is a really thorny problem. But I think I do believe we're at a tipping point. 2 years ago, we're not seeing the headlines in the conversation that we're seeing now. We're also, everyone in this room and all of us here are also creating a new vocabulary. There's civic tech. There's tech in the public interest. There's tech for social good. I think all of us are getting impatient that we are waiting for the movement to happen when we, in fact, are that movement. And we have to look for those channels, and we have to work together. It is remarkable to me when we do come out with test results that we get a call right away from the company we happen to be rating and saying, what do we do wrong? How can I do it better? And then that's exactly what we see in 48 hours of real-time change. And the moment we announced our digital lab this morning, the FTC rang me up. Like, hey, can you guys come talk to us? I was like, okay. And and of course, then the next thing we have to spur is we have to demonstrate to the public that there are alternatives. That's on us. We have to demonstrate and show that path and take them with us. And that's why I think this is a really exciting moment for all of us, but there are no easy answers. There's a laundry list, you've heard from everybody up here, of things that we need to try and do.
Awesome. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more question, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Samara. I'm a software engineer at Sidewalk Labs. I have a question about whether it's actually possible for states at the state level to enable something like the Digital Platform Act without the federal government needing to act overall. Would companies just end up moving states in order not to be subject to these particular laws? Is this legally permissible? And are there already efforts that are going on to do this? I know Craig talked about this in California a little bit, which is where I'm from. But
I'm sure Harold and Marta will have thoughts on that. Just very quickly, I think it's you sort of have to take the opportunities wherever you can, right? So I wouldn't want to discount what we can do at the state level. I think Craig is right. We have to keep pushing the boundaries, but there are going to be challenges, right? There are going to be legal challenges around preemption of authority. There's the patchwork problem that you named. I mean, I do think if you're talking about a state like California or a state like New York, where there's so much of the market, that the consumer market that folks are interested in are there, that gives a kind of bargaining power, right? But it's not I would think of it as experimentation that can start showing the proofs of concept that get us to not just national, but actually these are global challenges. And just one quick sentence to Sahar's question, because I think it's related, right? I think this whole point about trade-offs is really key. We just have to be willing to eat some costs, we the public. We're going to lose some things if we impose some of these rules, but we're going to gain some things too. And I think we have to be honest about that. I feel a lot of times we have these conversations, we think we can have our cake and eat it too. And what ends up happening is that our cake gets eaten, but not theirs, right? Because we think we can have all this great innovation, and also it won't cause anyone any harm, but that's actually not true, right? And so if we want to defend the public interest, that means that certain types of practices are not going to be possible anymore, and that maybe some conveniences actually go down, but we gain something back, and that's the trade-off that we ought to be willing to make.
Right.
I'll just be real quick because we're running out of time. The last chapter of my book is entirely about this, and it's a good point. I actually think that redundancy is critically important for stability. And it was Louis Brandeis who was the guy who pushed for things like the Federal Trade Commission, who also said that the states are the 50 laboratories of democracy, and that there are feedback loops back and forth. Pushing the federal government. We are having just one real quick, we are finally having a serious conversation in Washington, D.C. about federal privacy. Why? Because California passed a law. Now, of course, the bargaining chip for the companies to come to the table is, but we want preemption so that we can get a weaker federal law and get rid of California law. So, we got to be careful about how we do this. I think that there's plenty of room for a federal floor, and then states having freedom to do more. And if, frankly, states make a mistake and go too far in one direction and companies, relocate, that's a good feedback mechanism.
So I think we're going to end on that note, though I have to say that hearing the phrase, we're finally having a serious conversation in Washington, D.C.
I think we're having a serious
is, I don't know how exactly to interpret that. Is that, wow, really? Okay. So thank you to our panel. This is really great food for thought. Really appreciate it. We're going to follow your work. Everybody here is doing amazing stuff on this front. A big hand to our panel, and we're going to get ready for our next